Good afternoon, Trojan family. I'm Erica Maldonado Singh, Associate Director of USC Dornsife Alumni Relations. We're happy to have you with us for today's Dornsife Dialogue. If you're watching on Zoom, you're welcome to submit a question at any time using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. If you have to leave today's discussion at any point or you want to watch or listen to it again, you have two options. It will be on our Dornsife Dialogues podcast, available on all your favorite podcast platforms, and a link to the video will be on the Dornsife Dialogues page of our website. If you're not already following USC Dornsife on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, or YouTube, please do. We share fascinating research from our scholars and much more. Our handle on all of those platforms is at USC Dornsife. Now I'll turn it over to the Dean of USC Dornsife College of Letters, Arts, and Sciences, Amber Miller.
Welcome to our last Dornsife Dialogue of the academic year. Our topic today is a summer one, keeping cool. The International Energy Agency projects that the energy demand from air conditioners worldwide is expected to triple by 2050. This means that we are going to need to generate as much new electricity as the total current capacity in the United States, the EU, and Japan combined, just to meet our air conditioning needs. Generating this much additional electricity without exacerbating the warming of the planet is going to require a range of solutions, from increasing tree coverage to cool urban environments to improve thermoelectric cooling and other technological solutions. You'll be familiar with some of these if you've read the most recent edition of our USC Dornsife magazine, which explores cooling in depth from a wide range of angles. So let's get to it. We have a terrific panel today, and it is my pleasure to welcome our moderator, Alex Cohen, back to USC Dornsife. Alex is host of Spectrum News 1's Inside the Issues with Alex Cohen, which is dedicated to Southern Californian human interest stories. She has received a Golden Mike Award for Best Live Coverage of a News Story, the LA Press Club Award for Best Anchor, and an Emmy Award as part of the Spectrum News team. I'll turn the program over now to Alex, who will introduce our panelists. Thank you again for tuning in, and we'll see you back in August.
Thank you so much for that warm introduction. You mentioned the LA Press Club. I'm very pleased to announce that last night I took home a second place award in local politics and government, but the real kudos goes to USC Dornsife. I happen to have fresh in my hands. They won a big award last night at this event as well. And, you know, keeping up on socials, as Erica mentioned, a great way to know that's going on, but this is such a beautiful publication that, as they noted, really matches my backdrop today. So a shout out to this. And now it is my pleasure to welcome our audience today and our esteemed panelists. We have with us Tony Addy, a PhD in chemistry and alumnus of the Locher Hydrocarbon Research Institute at USC Dornsife. He is also CEO of a company called Phenonic that we're going to be hearing a lot more about this hour. They are working to really reinvent cooling as we know it. So Tony, thank you so much for being with us today. And next up, we have John P. Wilson, who is the director of USC Spatial Science Institute, a professor of architecture, civil and environmental engineering, computer science, population and public health sciences, sociology and spatial sciences, and project lead of the USC Urban Trees Initiative. John P. Wilson, thank you so much for joining us today as well.
Thank you.
And to give our audience a little bit of a better sense of who you are as people, why you care so much about this particular topic, we thought we would start off with a little bit of an icebreaker, probably pun intended in this circumstance. Just before we got started, I was letting the folks at USC Dornsife know that I just spent the weekend in La Quinta, one of my favorite places to be here in Southern California, but man, oh man, is it hot, as I learned the hard way when I went out on a run with no water in the middle of the day. I don't know what I was thinking. So gentlemen, my question for you, and Tony, let's start with you first. I'd like you to think back to a moment in your life where you were just incredibly hot, hotter than any other moment you've ever been. Where were you? What was going on? And what did you do about it?
Well, the irony is the first 20 years of my life were spent growing up in Buffalo, New York. So the number of times I was overwhelmingly hot were far and few in between. But now having then spent years in Southern California and then New York City, and now our home in Durham, North Carolina, the one that jumps out is my time in New York City when I had moved from R&D into investment banking was when one of the power outages had happened in the peak summer of New York in mid-August. And with a newborn at home and family in from out of town visiting, you could feel the heat and humidity in Manhattan was overwhelming and overbearing. And we complained because we lost air conditioning and power for maybe 12 hours. Yet now, having grown Phononic as an innovator of cooling solutions and spent a lot of time flying around the world, you meet people who live in those kinds of climates all the time and don't have the understanding, but now have the expectation for cooling. And it's been a very powerful reminder that technology, innovation, and entrepreneurship has a very real world impact on the way people live.
Thank you for that. And John P. Wilson, we'll turn it over to you. When do you remember just being hotter than I'll get out? Where were you? What did you do about it?
So I started life in the South Island in New Zealand, and I came to North America, I think, in 1979 to do a PhD at the University of Toronto. And for the 6 months leading up to my travels to North America, people were giving me lots of heaps of trouble about how cold it was going to be. I was going to freeze to death, etc., etc. So I got to Toronto by way of a flight to Honolulu, to Los Angeles, and then to Toronto. And I got there early in the morning on Labor Day in September. And to that point in my life, it was, I think that day, about 100 degrees Fahrenheit and about 90% humidity. And so what's really important about heat here is that maybe a heat index, which the hotter the temperature, the worse it is, but the more the humidity and the heat, then even worse it is. And I just remember thinking, wow, I wonder why they were giving me such a hard time about how cold it was going to be, given how damn warm it is today. Up to that point in my life, that was the warmest day I'd ever experienced. Fast forward to Christmas Day, it was a blizzard, it was minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit. And so in the space of 6 months, I probably saw the 2 hottest days ever in my life. And both were uncomfortable and both required care and attention because in your case, like going for a run without a water bottle, this is potentially hazardous, harmful, and in worst cases, one could perish. So it's a big topic. And of course, if you looked at CNN this morning, you'd see that there's a forecast now that 3/4 of the US might have power outages this summer because of the electricity load on the existing network, notwithstanding needing to build an even bigger one, as Amber said in her opening remarks.
Well, that sets the stage where we can talk about the current state of heat. And a reminder again to our audience, if you've got questions for either of our participants today, please feel free to share them in the Q&A section, and we'll take them as we go along our conversation today. So John, let's stick with you. And I think I'm pretty sure that anybody watching this at any time is well aware of the fact that we are living on a warmer planet. But I always think it's a good reminder to set the stage a little bit. What do we know about increasing temperatures here in our region, throughout the world? How did we get here, and where might we be going if we don't find better ways to mitigate the heat?
So I think we see evidence all across the planet. So I think this past few days in Beijing and China have set a heat record for maybe 50 or 60 years, the hottest 3 or 4 days period in a row. In New Zealand, where I started life, the Tasman Sea between New Zealand and Australia is 6 or 7 degrees Celsius warmer today than it has in any period of the recorded measured history of water temperatures in that water body. And what that's meant is that tropical cyclones, which we here call hurricanes, now go further south, just as we can expect them in North America with a warming ocean and a warming atmosphere to go further north. And so, you know, suddenly places that maybe didn't experience these events in recent human history, we'll see them again. And in addition to changes in temperature and, you know, people picking themselves up and migrating across North Africa to the Mediterranean Sea to try to get to a better life in Europe, then there's the changing patterns of precipitation. more precipitation, less precipitation, more big storms, less modest storms, and so forth. And so there's a lot of facets to warming, and it's literally occurring everywhere.
And Tony, let's have you pick up on that, and especially you're looking at places all over the world. You mentioned in our icebreaker, knowing that what you experienced in, one slice of time is something that a lot of people deal with on a regular basis. What does that mean? What's the bigger picture impact of that? Why do we need to be thinking about this?
Well, the consequences, what John laid out, is we're now living in this vicious cycle, whereas the world gets hotter, standards of living increase across the globe. There's an expectation for the same standards of living that we enjoy, which namely involves cooling and air conditioning. The dilemma is the classical mechanical methods that are used to provide that cooling use refrigerants that are toxic, chlorinated, and fluorinated. And more importantly, roughly 40 to 50% of that refrigerant will leak out of a product through its standard life cycle. When those refrigerants are leaked into the atmosphere, they have a heat trapping effect, which is thousands of times greater than naturally occurring CO2 does on its own. So this cycle of ever increasing temperature of the globe, the demand for cooling, the release of the refrigerants simply exacerbates that global warming problem. The dilemma is this has been largely unchecked and uncovered for some time. The truth is the world's doing an okay job addressing CO2 emissions from traditional sources, combustion and power generation, the electrical grid notwithstanding. The dilemma, as you peel back that onion, the next frontier is this refrigerant dilemma, where the more we consume this conventional method of mechanical cooling, the more we're aggravating the respective problem. And now what you're seeing is governments around the world are reacting in a very patchwork manner, where they're outlining the use of many of these refrigerants, but they're doing it in different phases in different regions. And that makes manufacturing products an absolute nightmare. So we believe that Phononic, with our investor group, that incremental improvements won't get us where we need to be. It needs a completely new and innovative and candidly transformative approach. And that's what Phononic was meant to do, not just make a nominal existing mechanical system slightly better, but avoid it altogether with a semiconductor platform following the same precedences that have made California and innovation and American entrepreneurship famous.
And I promise we will get there and we'll explain exactly what you're doing there at Phononic. But I'd like to kind of delve in a little bit further. Either you or John, I'd love to hear from you both to talk about, I think, a lot of us experience heat as a comfort issue. The AC is broken, or I'm going to make sure the AC is up and running in my car before I go in to pick up the kids from school, whatever it might be. But clearly heat can also be a political issue, an economic issue. Talk to us a little bit, especially as you mentioned, where there's those patchwork responses. What is the bigger kind of ripple effect of extreme?
Well, if I could just expand on my point, it's even more fundamental to our economy. If you look at the major segments where Phononic is positioned, data communications, cold chain storage and last mile food delivery, and HVAC, those are all areas fundamental to our economy and our standard of living where the incumbent methods are insufficient. So it's not just about comfort on a hot day in Los Angeles, it's about food safety, food compliance, food transport, cold chain logistics. The methods used to cool those perishable or frozen items are ineffective at very high temperatures. Mechanical methods break down. So beyond just politics, this is an economic safety issue with respect to this dilemma. And it requires a dramatic response. And you have to understand the impact that this goes beyond just simply comfort, but as John mentioned early, perishable safety of our community.
And John, do you want to chime in on that as well? I mean, even in terms of thinking about the educational impact, right? Kids are at school, the asphalt is too hot, they can't go outside. What are some of the other things that we should be thinking about?
Well, I've been I lead this project called the Urban Trees Initiative here in California. So we're working in 6 communities and just east of downtown and northeast of downtown. And there's about 250,000 people that live in those 6 neighborhoods. And there's more people than there is trees. So and we've counted all the trees on private land and on public property, cemetery, school campuses, streets and parks and so forth. And so in one of the communities, for every for every 4 people, there's 1 tree. And these are households that have very modest incomes. Median household income might be somewhere between 30 and 40,000. The average household size might be 3.5 or 4 people per household, and then you pile on maybe 20% of the households have no vehicle, so they're transit dependent. And one solution on a really hot day would be to find, and many of the houses are modest in size. They were built in the 1930s and 1940s, and they don't even have the traditional conditioning units that Tony has referred to that break down in really hot weather. So you've got a firestorm here, literally, because there's no relief from a series of hot days, 90 degrees or higher at home. Likely there's not on a school campus, as you alluded to. That's mostly asphalt because it's easy to care for, surprisingly. And many of these people neither have the means nor the income, likely, to say, well, hell, let's get out of here, kids, and go to the beach for the day, right? And so, as in Los Angeles, if you go from 70 degrees Fahrenheit at the beach on a summer's day, even like today, by the time you get to downtown, it's likely 80 degrees, and then you go just a few miles further inland and it's climbed to 85, and then a few more miles it gets to 90. And so it's everywhere, at every scale, globally, nationally, in every state probably. It's a big deal. The equity aspects of this, I think, are a really big deal. And so there's no one solution that would suit everybody. We need to take a whole of problem, a whole series of responses to help people cope with the ever-increasing numbers of hot days.
You mentioned the trees, and just to play devil's advocate for a moment, especially when you get to some of those hotter days, the 90s or 100, a lot of folks might say, hey, sitting under a tree is not going to do that much for me. Explain what trees actually can do, both in terms of human comfort and just heating overall.
So trees are going to do typically 2 things. One, if it's a big canopy, then there will be some relief from sitting in the shade under the tree. And then at the top of the tree, transpiration is always occurring, and that's providing some reduction in the heat in the lower atmosphere. But there are a lot of complications here, because the buildings are likely absorbing heat and then re-emitting it back to the surface, or the atmosphere just above the surface. And so sometimes you'll see people talk about an urban heat island, and that's in the classic case. If you have a whole bunch of buildings built with concrete and brick and so forth, then they're going to absorb the heat during the sun. And then in the evening, even after the sun goes down, they're going to give all of that heat back to the atmosphere. And in parts of Texas and Arizona, I think the big effect is that those processes then put a lot more heat back in the atmosphere overnight. And it's very difficult to have a good night's sleep if, in fact, you're not thermally comfortable. And so there's a lot of complications here. The big rub about trees might be in Los Angeles is that we're also short of water in the southwestern United States. And so how do you balance this? And my attitude has been, in leading the Urban Trees Initiative, is that we could be thinking of different species of trees, so that we have trees that are suited to a climate that might arrive in 2040 or 2050, because it takes 10 or 20 years before the tree can provide effective shade. And then also in thinking about the configuration, most of the parks in Los Angeles look like parks in New England. In New England, you want big, wide, open spaces so that you can extend the life of the park into the fall and kick up life in the park at the beginning of spring. In the southwestern United States, the climate's very different, and we should be building parts of parks at least to be cooling centers, and so they might have more or less a full canopy of cover, and so that people on the really hottest days could find refuge there.
And we're starting to see some questions from our audience trickle in. We'll start getting to those in a moment. And I want to encourage anyone watching this live on the 26th to share any questions, comments that you might have, especially hearing about East Coast trees versus what West Coast parks should look like. Tony, I happen to know, because you and I have had a chance to talk about it, that the technology that Phononic employs, it's a little bit more complicated than trees providing shade, but in layman's terms, can you explain for us what you all are doing and how that can help address heat?
Well, look, semiconductor innovation has transformed our way of life, starting in Silicon Valley, which is not randomly named. The way we communicate, the way we harness the sun, the way we light our buildings, now even the way automobiles can see around corners are all dramatic examples of semiconductor chip innovation. Yet in the world of cooling and refrigeration, there had been very little headway. And if you look at the fundamentals behind Phononic, thermoelectric cooling, even the origins of our name, we are moving phonons of heat, not unlike semiconductors have moved photons of light. The difference is we've made dramatic improvements at not only the chip, but the system architecture that brings that chip to life in disruptive products. And when you do that, you can now have a very effective, elegant, and sustainable manner of managing heat, not unlike the way semiconductors have managed light. Those were the origins of our company. In the first third of our origin, we looked like a material science semiconductor packaging exercise. We then moved into systems integration. And now over the last 24 to 36 months, those examples that you referenced about the relationship with heat, we've now seen dramatic pull in a variety of industries that are really struggling to get the adequate cooling they need to deliver the service that we're accustomed to getting, whether it's data transmission and optics, whether it's food storage, delivery, and transport, or whether it's the comfort of the buildings and the houses that we live in every day. Those are the solutions we're now driving.
And when you talk about the human side of it, us staying cool when we want to, you have some new HVAC technology that's going to be launched this summer. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, my professors at Local would be upset if I started reinventing the laws of thermodynamics. So I want to be careful that the gains we bring to the table is our ability to manipulate and move and manage heat. And the mistake that mechanical methods use is they have massive swings of temperature, which is why in an office building, you're wearing a sweater in the summer or you're sweating in the winter. What we've done as a first entree into the market is we've hybridized in a commercial installation in Europe with the traditional chiller that sits atop the building. Except here, instead of asking the chiller to handle the entire thermal load of the building, the chiller only partly or partially cools the outside ambient air. And then as that partially cooled air is distributed and plumbed throughout the building, Phononic's air handling units are integrated into the ceiling in all of the respective workable space. And when you marry the chiller's ability to do partial work with our ability to take it the rest of the way, you get a very finely tuned level of cooling, the joint combined efficiencies of both systems. And in the benchtop testing we've done, we've seen almost a 30% drop in electricity, but more importantly, an almost 50% drop in carbon signature because our systems have no refrigerants whatsoever. So as that building goes live this summer and fall, there'll be a lot of news and announcements in that regard. And we're excited to use that as the next platform in our go-to-market strategy.
What does it look like? Because we hear all the time, for example, when it comes to earthquake safety, we've got a lot of older buildings here in our region, just the sheer cost of trying to retrofit. What would it take? How expensive is it to try to replace the more traditional HVACs with the systems that you're not?
This is a great question. And it's where the solar and LED industries have paved a path for us. We want to change the narrative to one of transition from hardware, as you mentioned, which is scary, expensive, and retrofitish, and change the dialogue to installed capacity, where we can go to a building owner or a homeowner and put in fixed 10, 20, or even 30-year HVAC contracts with a dramatic reduction in spend on electricity savings and meeting their carbon metrics. But now we're financing cooling, which allows us to then finance hardware. So it's just like solar saw its growth when it moved away from the cost of an individual panel and instead moved into the cost of an electricity contract. We want to do the same with cooling, where with that commercial building that we'll have launched this summer, we'll be able to market cooling contracts or cooling as a service, as opposed to an individual air handling unit that has to go into the building or multiple air handling units that goes into the building. So as a final example, this summer, there's almost 300 air handling units that use our technology in that building. But cumulatively, that's more than 150 kilowatts of first of its kind solid state semiconductor cooling and heating. And when you amortize that over the 10 to 20 to 30 year lifetime of a building, Alex, the savings are financeable. And you take the emphasis off the hardware and more on the service.
I mentioned earlier the parallel of seismic safety.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things about earthquakes is, I think when we hear about the damage that an earthquake can cause, everybody's got an image in their mind, right, of Northridge here or
Sure.
abroad, and we know that footage of buildings toppled and hundreds of people or thousands of people who've died. I feel like heat is trickier. I had the opportunity to speak with LA's chief heat officer, Marta Segura, who said, there's no great visuals for heat, even though it kills people as well. I'd love to hear from both of you. And John Wilson, let's hear from you first. Can you describe the way that we talk about heat and think about heat and the impact that has in terms of how we address heat compared with maybe other natural disasters?
Okay, so I think there's a report from the CDC that would tell us that heat is the leading cause of heat stress is the leading cause of death in the United States on an annual basis, and the difficulty is, it's not an equal opportunity kind of hazard. So it's going to have the largest impacts on the people that are probably least capable of dealing with additional heat and humidity, that already have pre-existing medical conditions or less than optimal lifestyles and therefore health conditions. And so, it reminds me a bit around the whole arguments around COVID and how many people died, and did they die of COVID, or did they pass for some other reason, or was there a combination of reasons? And so it sort of flies below the radar because of that. And so, the kinds of natural disasters that steal the headlines are those big calamitous events that happened in a couple of days or a split second, like an earthquake. Whereas the role of extreme heat and humidity here, it's continuous, and the thing that's changing is across many parts of the United States is that the number of days above a certain temperature or with a certain heat stress score is growing all the time, virtually everywhere, and as a consequence, then we expect more deaths. But we can predict where the conditions are worse. The last few days, I think in Texas and Arizona, they've consistently been home to the 10 hottest cities in the United States of America. Many days that will be the case, but at different times of the year, there will be problems in Los Angeles and San Francisco and Seattle and Chicago, and then, as Tony said, all up and down the Beltway in the northeastern United States. So it's just a huge problem.
Alex, one of the things we've experienced is when you talk about the big calamitous issues here on the East Coast, hurricanes is probably the closest thing that comes to mind. Southern California, it's earthquakes. Tragically, when those situations are repaired, it's often done with government funds or insurance funds. And other than the dilemma of seeing your structure destroyed, the average person doesn't necessarily see or understand or bear that cost. The irony with heat is you do when it comes to your monthly electric bill, whether you're a residential unit or whether you're in a commercial building, beyond the comfort associated with the heat load of your city or your living area, you see it every month when that electric bill comes in. And if you go back to the comment I made earlier about our commercial installation, we want to be able to show to the landlord in that particular case that financing this solution across their portfolio of properties collectively lowers their electricity bills over the lifetime of a building by tens of millions of dollars. So the one unique aspect of heat while it might not be obvious in terms of the next frontier and sustainability that it presents, it's the one that's the most tangibly economic, because almost everyone deals with it monthly with their electric bill. And what we've tried to do at Phononic is connect those dots so people understand there are solutions that can address that energy bill, that electric bill, but are doing so sustainably.
So we started to get some great questions in from our audience. And again, I want to encourage folks to share your questions. Let us know your name if you like and your question for Tony, John, or both. This one comes from Enrique, who asks, the state of California has invested billions in several grant programs, including urban forestry, building weatherization, and air conditioning systems, and yet extreme heat fatalities are on the rise. Extreme heat kills more Californians per year than all other climate hazards. What are the gaps in funding? John, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, that's a really ambitious question. So I had to bite my tongue for a second. Well, there are many dimensions here. I'm one of the authors of a paper that looked at tree canopy cover across the Los Angeles metropolitan area for the decade 2000-2010. And even then, on private property, we just looked at single family homes across the 20 largest cities in each of the LA council districts. And in every single jurisdiction, the urban tree canopy was declining, where a landowner pulled a permit to do something to their built environment, then I think the average loss was about 7%. And even where they didn't pull a permit, the average loss was 2%. So maybe it was the cost of water, maybe it was they were tired of cleaning up after the tree. If it was deciduous, it's going to drop its leaves every year, and so on and so forth. So there are some lifestyle issues that might be attached to trees that people get sick of or don't like. And so that's on private property. In a big metropolitan area, there's typically more trees on private property than public property. And then everywhere in, certainly America's cities, they're bustling with energy, with dynamism like Tony's spoken to. And so there's adaptive reuse, there's old buildings that get pulled down, new ones that get built and so forth. And so to some extent, the development process clobbers even more parts of the tree canopy. And in many jurisdictions now, there is a 1-for-1 replacement. But if you cut down a tree that's 70 years old and you replace it with a tree that's 8 feet tall, it's going to take maybe 50 or 70 years to get the same tree back that you cut down. And so there's just a lot of subtleties to this conversation. And while more money is being added here, there's a tremendous, particularly in the public sector, there's a tremendous competition for funds. In California, people are interested in urban canopy. They're interested in nowadays affordable housing and building more housing units. Many people will put their hand up and say we need better freeways or more freeways. Others are going to put their hand up and say we need better and more transit systems. And then still others are going to say we need to invest in our children, and therefore we need to make investments in public education. And so it's a question then of, well, where does growing a tree canopy fit within all of these, next to all of these other needs and aspirations? And the equity question, I think, looms large, because there's tremendous variability between, say, the communities I'm working with on the east side and Pacific Palisades or the city of Pasadena, which traditionally have been the two areas in the LA basin that have the best tree canopy. And so it's not just about how many funds are dedicated, but it's where those funds are being spent and for what purpose.
And I think the timeliness of this, we are literally discussing this as legislators are trying to hash out with the governor in Sacramento, not only, how to spend the money that we have, but they're doing so in the midst of a $31.5 billion deficit, this after years of surplus. Tony, Addie, how are you seeing this play out in your world? What do you see as the gaps in funding, as Enrique asked?
Well, this is being in the venture capital private equity world, it's a very different set of issues. There are tremendous funds set aside for sustainability investing. This is expensive. This is not easy, nor is it for the faint of heart, whether it's John's work or mine. The good news is we're now starting to connect the dots of sustainability investment with economic return. Solar has been a dramatic example of this. LED. You're now seeing the same in the building sector and construction with different materials. So the good news is the institutional investment world is now mandating efficiency, mandating sustainability, and establishing funds and indices that invest in companies like mine. And those are not just in North America, those are funds that are based all over the world. So it's incumbent upon us to connect the dots as entrepreneurs with those kinds of companies that are bold, audacious, addressing these big problems, because big outcomes are expected by these funds. So as we counsel entrepreneurs in our world, it's to remind them the magnitude and enormity of the problem they're trying to solve, but show the magnitude and enormity of the economic return so that you can bring that capital off the sidelines.
And John, in your answer, you raised a couple of points that goes to one of the questions that we've received from an audience member. And again, anyone just tuning in now live, feel free to share your questions for either or both of our panelists with us. This question reads, trees can take significant time to mature, and technology can be financially out of reach for the most vulnerable without financing. What are ways you imagine being able to reach those vulnerable populations sooner? What is the role of state and local government in this work? And I'd love to hear from both of you, whoever wants to jump in first.
Maybe Tony, I could start.
Please.
So my students and I have, over the last 12 or 18 months, gathered data and then thought of creative ways to use those data so that wherever we do plant trees, we could anticipate the best return on investment. In other words, it provides the best relief possible to people living in these neighborhoods and as quickly as possible. So it's about what trees you plant, it's about how big the trees are when you plant them, and it's about where you plant them. And so we've done some work where we've taken, with the kind of work that I do, I know where all the households are that house people. I know where all the schools are, I know where all the transit stops are, and I can model the expected pedestrian traffic on local streets with a caregiver walking their child to and from elementary school. And so rather than just plant trees on all of the available spaces, let's plant street trees along corridors where we expect heavy pedestrian traffic. And let's do it in thoughtful ways that we can get to some kind of shade canopy relatively quickly. Now, if we wanted to green school campuses at the same time, because I think in Sacramento they're talking about putting some funds towards that issue as well, then more power to them. But I would say we need to think of the school campus and the area immediately around it if we want to have the best possible impact. So there's lots of ways that we could be perhaps using the resources that are available more thoughtfully, and in order to address the needs of people who have few other means to find an alternative solution. And I'll stop.
Yeah, I think the most powerful part of the question is how to take technology that's deemed to be financially out of reach and bring it within reach. And I think in our experiences, it comes down to the business model. Tesla came out with a high-end premium vehicle that took the world by storm, but it was a very expensively priced automobile that went for a specific part of the population. Now, over time, at volume and scale, they're driving those costs out. That's one method of driving technology adoption. We would go back to the method I mentioned earlier, where through a licensing approach, we can get to scale over the lifetime of a product, and with scaled commitments that allows us to bring institutional capital, not personal capital, but institutional capital in to finance these growth. And then that transition the expense to the average user from away from a one-time capital purchase to one more of an operating or a leasing kind of an expense, which is more within their budgets. That's we've seen to be the most powerful way to drive adoption across various income levels and the differences between residential, commercial, and industrial users.
A question from an audience member named Elizabeth, and I think this one would most likely go to John. Would replacing concrete with unimproved areas such as soil and gardening help with heat and pollution?
Well, I think, generally there's again, a whole conundrum of challenges here because, in most big cities, including Los Angeles, we've dramatically changed the patterns of water flow. For one, you know, most of the surface of many big cities now are impermeable rather than permeable. So, you know, we concreted the LA River because we had a flood problem. Urbanization made the flood problem worse. And so the whole purpose of a river that has two concrete sides and a concrete bottom is that you minimize the friction, you maximize the slope so that you can move as much water as quickly as possible to the ocean. Ironically, we live in a semi-arid environment, and so then we had to then invest millions of dollars in bringing water from afar when the water that nature provides locally is put in the ocean as quickly as possible, right? So 100 years ago, that may be, and for all I know, I would have thought that was smart thinking, right? But given the kinds of things that we can do with technology today, I think we might have thought of different solutions had we settled Los Angeles today and dreamed that we would one day create a large metropolitan area like we have. So the concrete's a problem because it minimizes the amount of water that soaks into the ground that could provide a part of the water supply for trees once they're established to grow without any further supplemental water. And in many cases, if you look at LA, I would guess that about 30% or more of the surface is taken up with various forms of mobility, transportation, roads and freeways, sidewalks, surface parking lots, parking garages, and so forth. And so if you wanted to reclaim part of the city to build a more environmentally sustainable and better organized system for life, then they're the obvious place to take back some of the real estate. However, if it's covered in concrete, then these concrete cuts, for example, to plant trees, are hugely expensive. And so we need a kind of a whole of system approach to thinking about what we need to do to make cities more attractive, more livable, and more accessible to everybody, not just the well-to-do and so forth. And we need to think of the kinds of solutions that Tony's talking about with his company, because just changing the urban canopy is not going to solve this problem. We need all of these solutions to be implemented more or less simultaneously so that we can make forward motion.
And I just want to go back for a moment when, John, you were laying out some of the early choices that were made here in this region. I would be remiss if I didn't say it would be a great opportunity for those more interested in that to check out the Dornsife dialogue that we did on the topic of water, featuring Bill Deverell, which gets into a lot of the history there, and you can see how these things happen. Tony, you know, as John just mentioned, it's not the one solution is going to fix everything. We've been honing in mostly on trees and technology. What else is out there that you feel like we can and should be thinking about as we think about this problem?
So one interesting marriage that we're seeing in our own company is the combination of technology innovation with data management. All of our systems, particularly in cold chain food transport, but also HVAC, the ability to monitor in real time changes in temperature and have your technology solution respond accordingly is incredibly powerful. So as examples, in cold chain food storage and transport, we can detect in the totes that are transporting food and frozen items if the unit is having a problem, there's a breakdown, if there's a change in the ambient condition, it got hot because it was taken out of a vehicle, we can respond accordingly and provide that cooling in real time to either avoid spoilage or to either avoid damage. Similarly, with a home marriage or with a building, marriage of energy building software management with our units, which are placed in individual rooms in the building, we can understand and measure real-time changes if there's people inside the room, if there's not. So you can have this really neat puzzle of turning and flexing units on and off and only providing the cooling where and when you need it. And in some of our commercial installations in grocery, we've seen huge energy savings by being able to tune the cooling and refrigeration when you need it, as opposed to the often fixed and rigid infrastructure that we're used to. So we're enamored with our technology solution. We're excited about the services and the cooling that is provided. The next frontier to us is marry it with much of the data management that we take for granted to better tune and fine tune our capabilities.
And John, how about you? As you look out there, what else are you seeing or you think we should be seeing when it comes to mitigating heat beyond trees and technology?
Well, I think just to play off what Tony just said, all of what Tony said is brilliant, and we should be thinking about those kinds of monitoring systems and the ability to change our solutions in near real time across everything. And so one place where I think we're starting to do that now, as Tony said earlier, there's a big investment in solar. And so certainly in Southern California, there's tremendous opportunities to generate solar electricity. But most of us live in an environment where we have different rates. We're charged for electricity at different times of the day. And generally when the solar is being generated, they are when rates are lowest and when use levels are low. And so, I know in some big public sector projects and so forth in the Los Angeles basin now, they're busy making big investments around batteries and so forth so that they can generate solar during the day, store the energy.
Store it at night, yeah.
And then use it in the late afternoon, early evening. And so this is putting the opportunity to be decision makers in the hands of those that generate the electricity and that pay these big electricity bills that Tony and I have been alluding to. And so there are ways for us to reorganize life that would change the pressure on the grid, would change people's bank books and the money they had in their pocket. We just have to come together and find a collective kind of will and strategy with which to implement many of these changes. Technology can be a tremendous boost here in how we organize life and how we sustain ourselves going forward.
There's a specific question for Tony from Kathy, who asks, heat pump HVAC heating and cooling hardware has been aggressively promoted to California consumers lately, mainly because there's a movement to continue the use of natural gas. Where does phononic technology fit into this narrative?
Sure. So that what Kathy's referring to in terms of traditional heat pumps are part of a geothermal category, where you're taking advantage of temperature gradients within heat and humidity trapped within the crust or the ground. And then as it comes up, the change in temperature allows you to leverage that to generate power or cooling. That tends to be unique to the Southwest because those systems are ideally designed for low humidity and arid environments. So where phononic would play into something like that is not unlike the situation we have in Europe, where we complement and hybridize within the building. So whether it's chilled water plants in Europe, where the chiller handles the bulk load, and then we come in and fine tune throughout the building, or in this case, if geothermal was to provide a partial level of the cooling, we would take it the last yard or the last mile, if you will, of cooling. And it's the combination of brute force with elegance is what gives you the dramatic savings that we can bring to the table. So we embrace all of the various methods of combustion, whether it's solar and the storage method that John referenced, whether it's integrating in with a chilled water system or even something like an HVAC system. If you can avoid having the mechanical system have to do all of the work, you can see some dramatic improvements in efficiency and net carbon reduction.
And a reminder as we head into our last 10 minutes of today's program, if you've got questions for our panelists that you'd like to see us address, please share them with us now in the Q&A section. This question comes from Frank. How do you see new multifamily developments being designed to address the challenges that you are highlighting in terms of key strategies?
Well, we're just starting to scratch the surface of this, if I could jump in, Alex. So with the commercial installation pending in Europe, we are now having conversations with real estate developers and REIT trusts that own multi-tenant developments. And we're trying to demonstrate the 10, 20, and 30-year savings of the current commercial installation so that they can implement across their portfolio. We want to avoid, Frank, one-off projects where you do one location, deal with the building owner, do another location. And we're trying to go to the real estate development groups that manage multiple properties, and whether it's a retrofit or a new build, show how we can aggregate these savings over the lifetime of the building. And that's something we'll be rolling out later this year and early next.
And John Wilson, do you care to take on this question about design, especially for multifamily developments and things we should be bearing in mind?
Well, I think one common trend I see in Southern California is that, many multi-unit developments now use nearly the whole lot, and they typically have some small kind of green material at the front that's really designed just to look nice. We do the same with some of our roads and medians, either in the middle of the road or the spaces on the side of the road where we're not planting with the idea to providing mitigation from excess heat on hot and humid days. We've got a whole different strategy in mind, and so we need to prioritize what we're doing and why we're doing it. In a similar vein to Tony, we need to match up action with outcomes. and outcomes in both our cases, I think extend over 20 or 30 years, because in neither case do you get the return on investment that would make this sensible unless you're willing to go that long.
It's tricky too when you mention about how we build up on land. As we all probably know, land is at such a premium. Housing also remains such a perennial California crisis. It's a little bit of a whack-a-mole at times.
Yep.
So much, I feel like, of our conversation today has been looking at solutions externally, and I'm wondering if we can spend a little bit of time kind of turning it in towards us, the human beings. And I'd love to hear from each of you. And Tony, maybe we can start with you. It's great to think about ways that we can mitigate heat, but what can we as individual consumers, human beings, be doing to try to help address this heat issue as well?
It's a great question. It's even more broader than heat in terms of sustainability, Alex. Companies respond to consumer demand. It's that simple. So if you recognize that this thermal issue we're dealing with, this heat issue, affects our quality of life, it affects our electric bill, it affects our economy, you want to demand, whether it's in your housing development, whether it's in your commercial buildings, whether it's in the design of your cities, that you're factoring in all of these respective areas. Where does your power come from? How is your community designed? What's the transportation? How is your building cooled and comfort provided? Awareness is the most powerful sunshine, is the most powerful disinfectant in these kinds of situations. And we're trying to market our own company direct to the consumer, even though effectively our business model is B2B. And I'm happy to say that we're seeing our B2B customers recognize this, because they're asking for it in addition to the spec sheets and the technology and the normally quantitative questions that I ask my team. They're now asking about sustainability and net carbon reduction and comfort. So progress is being made, but I'd say I don't want to have to tell your viewers or our community that they have to sacrifice their quality of living. What I want them to do is be aware of sustainable alternatives and demand them.
And John Wilson, how would you answer that? What should we as individuals be doing each day, every day, to try to respond to this?
I could give you two answers, one about my life and one about work. I think in my life, I've decided to use transit. And so I can travel all the way around the Los Angeles basin on transit. I have the advantage that I can sit on a bus or a train and do some work or some reading, and that means it's not downtime, but nonetheless, my wife and I have one car, which really translates to she has a car and I don't. And so, it's dramatically reduced my carbon footprint in the sense that I had one of those Audi so-called zero emission diesel cars until I gave it back to them. So that's my personal response, and that like all the things we're talking about leads to more steps, a more active lifestyle, better health, better everything, and so there's a lot of win-win-wins there. In work, in the kind of work that my group has been doing, we've been working really hard to try and engage the community and have the community suggest what they want their neighborhoods to look like, so that there's a buy-in. And so they can advocate for change and changes that they would like. And I see that as important going forward as well, because I think the days when some smart ass comes and tells you what you need to do are long past. And we need to grow solutions and aspirations from the bottom up. And, there's no better place than to start with school children. I once, just as an exercise, had school children reimagine their school playground. And guess what? All the asphalt disappeared, and they wanted trees they could climb, trees they could do lots of things with. And so I think there's lots of opportunities.
We have a question from Jerry, who asks, lithium mining and processing is terribly toxic to the environment. Thus, batteries aren't the total solution. What other trade-offs do you see in any of the strategies we've been talking about today?
I think they all have trade-offs.
Yeah.
There's no way around that.
Yeah, it's there's no one silver bullet for these issues. It involves the consumer, it involves technology, it involves hybridization. There can't be one specific mantra. As a former battery research scientist at the Locher Institute, I think one of the most innovative things that Locher's done in battery technology is recognizing that lithium doesn't have to be the solution for all battery solutions. As an example, John mentioned some of the storage solutions for solar. Some of my former professors are at the forefront of redox flow battery technology that avoids the use of lithium and uses iron. So the good news is people are working on these solutions, but to expect that one will cure all, it's not practical. We have to be prepared for all the ramifications of this all-in solution.
One final audience question. To what extent should we be using building roofs for green space? Would roof gardens do anything to mitigate the heat island effect? Is there a good strategy for effective rooftop gardening?
Well, I think the answer is yes. It's maybe quite difficult to do that in a retrofitting kind of model. Mm-hmm. But certainly, I think one of the things that's happened over time that's highlighted in the Dornsife magazine story is that, societies hundreds of years ago, thousands of years ago, in really hot climates, knew how to build buildings in ways that you naturally mitigated heat and maximize shade and cooling and so forth. And so, I think the last 100 years we've sort of run away with our minds and thinking that we could construct our way out of every problem. And we just need a larger array of a larger palette of solutions and aspirations and things so that we could, take a few steps back and then start forward with some smarter solutions and ideas. Tony's company is a wonderful example of a group of people doing that.
Thank you.
We've just got a few moments left, but I would like to end with a look out to the future and just to hear briefly from each of you. How confident are you that we are headed to a better world, a cooler world, and one that you'll be able to see in your lifetime? And Tony, how about we start with you?
Well, that's an impossible question to ask an entrepreneur because we're built on optimism and enthusiasm. We believe we will overcome. Failure is not an option. I'm happy to say I learned that at USC. Dr. Surya Prakash and George Olah instilled that in me when I showed up as a bright-eyed grad student in my early 20s. Locher and their research is built on the belief in the impossible. So America's economy is based on solving problems like these. It may seem daunting, it may seem impossible, it may seem discouraging, but in every instance where we've let innovation flourish, our quality of life, our standard of living in our economy has grown with it. And I think if we can maintain that optimism that people like John and Phononic and the educators at SC are driving the next generation of students, we're going to get there. And I think if we can be collaborative and help one another, we'll see our way through even this.
John Wilson, care to add to those very optimistic words?
Well, I think the Earth is more resilient than we give it credit sometimes. And an example would be during COVID with some scholars in China. I did some work on spring in China in 2021, and spring arrived 8 days earlier than it had at any time during the previous 30 years. And that's because when you had everybody stay at home, you shut down heavy industry, and suddenly the skies were blue. And plants immediately responded and, flowered and grew leaves and so forth 8 days earlier than previously. And so there's every reason to think that if we could turn back some of the carbon emissions and some of these other problems, then the Earth would respond relatively quickly.
John P. Wilson and Tony Eddy, I want to thank you both so much for your time and your insight for this riveting conversation today. My thanks as well to USC Dornsife for allowing me to host this conversation, which, as Erica mentioned, will be, if you know folks who missed it that you think would enjoy it, it will be out there for posterity's sake in the near future. My thanks to everyone, and that concludes our panel today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Fight on.
Yep.